There is no isolation quite like the middle of the ocean at night, when the world disappears into the dark. The only thing that matters is the light. For 3,000 years, humanity has waged a quiet war against the storm. We started with simple fires on a hill. We evolved to stone towers that interlocked like puzzles. And eventually, we built cathedrals of glass that could turn a single flame into a star. This is not just a history of engineering. It is a history of vigilance, of the men and women who stood watch while the rest of the world slept. Tonight, we climb the stairs. Welcome to Dead Session History. In the beginning, there was only fire. Long before the elegant towers we know today, before revolving lenses and electric beacons, the first lighthouses were something far more elemental. Picture a hill rising above a darkened harbor. At its summit, flames dance against the night sky. A simple fire, burning steadily, calling sailors home. These were the first watchers in the dark, not the towering structures of stone and glass we imagine, but humble beacon fires of wood and brush, elevated high enough to be seen from the water. There was no technology here, no engineering marvel, just fire and the human determination to keep it burning. Imagine the keepers of these ancient lights. Night after night, they would tend their flames, feeding them, protecting them. There were no glass lanterns to shield the fire from the elements, no optical systems to focus and magnify the light. The beacon stood naked against the wind, vulnerable to every storm that rolled in from the sea. And the weather was relentless. Wind could scatter burning embers across the hilltop, turning a beacon into a hazard. Rain could hiss and spit against the flames, threatening to drown them entirely. Keeping these fires burning through a storm was a battle against nature itself, a test of will and endurance that demanded constant vigilance. Yet they burned. In ancient Greece, harbor masters maintained braziers on stone towers, guiding merchants and warships safely to port. The Romans, master engineers that they were, understood the value of these lights. They built towers, elevated platforms where fires could burn higher and brighter, visible for miles across the Mediterranean darkness. At Dover, Dubris, as the Romans knew it, they maintained one such lighthouse. It stood watch over the narrow channel, a sentinel of fire marking the gateway between Britannia and the continent. The tower still stands today, weathered by centuries, a reminder of how long humanity has been fighting back the darkness for those who travel by sea. These were not merely practical structures. They were promises, kept night after night, a promise that someone was watching, that someone cared whether you found your way home, that in the vast indifference of the ocean, there was at least one point of light you could trust. The fire on the hill was where it all began, where the idea took root that we could push back against the dark, that we could mark the dangerous places, guide the lost, and save the lives of strangers we would never meet. It was a simple thing, really, just fire. But it was enough. But there was one light that stood above all others, one beacon so magnificent, so impossibly tall, that it became legend. The Pharos of Alexandria. Construction began in the late 4th or early 3rd century, before the Common Era, on the small island of Pharos at the mouth of Alexandria's harbor. What rose from that island would become more than a lighthouse. It would become one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Imagine standing at its base, craning your neck upward. The tower climbed into the sky, tier upon tier of pale stone, rising over 100 meters above the waves. In an age when most buildings barely reached 3 stories, the Pharos soared higher than almost anything humanity had ever built. It was a mountain made by human hands, a declaration that we could reach toward the heavens themselves. At its summit, far above the city and the sea, a powerful beacon burned through every night. This was no simple hilltop fire. This was light weaponized, light transformed into something that could pierce dozens of miles across the Mediterranean darkness. The engineers of Alexandria had discovered something remarkable. By placing a polished metal mirror behind the flames, bronze, perhaps, buffed to a brilliant shine, they could gather the scattered light and throw it outward in a focused beam. The mirror caught every flicker, every dancing tongue of flame, and hurled it across the water with unprecedented strength. Ships could see the Pharos from distances that must have seemed magical. But maintaining such a light presented challenges unlike anything the ancient world had faced. Wood, the traditional fuel for beacon fires, was precious and scarce in Egypt. The desert held little timber, and importing enough wood to feed a nightly blaze atop a 100-meter tower would have been ruinously expensive. So the keepers adapted. They may have burned papyrus roots, bundled and dried, a resource Egypt had in abundance along the Nile. Or perhaps they used naphtha, that strange petroleum seepage that burned hot and bright and needed no timber at all. The exact fuel remains a mystery, lost to time, but we know the light never failed. Night after night, Year after year, century after century, the Pharos burned. It guided Cleopatra's ships and Caesar's galleys. It watched over merchants carrying grain and scholars carrying scrolls. It was the first thing sailors saw when approaching Alexandria, and the last light they glimpsed when departing. A farewell from the greatest city in the ancient world. For over 1,000 years it stood. 1,000 years of light, of salvation, of hope burning against the dark. When earthquakes finally brought it down, the world lost more than a building. It lost a symbol, proof that human ingenuity could create something both beautiful and essential, something that served and protected and endured. The Pharos is gone now, its stones scattered beneath the harbor waves, but its legacy remains. Every lighthouse that came after, in some way, descends from that ancient wonder. Every beam that sweeps across a darkened sea carries within it an echo of that first great light, burning high above Alexandria. But for every monument like the Pharos, there were hundreds of ordinary lights, humble beacons scattered along coastlines from Britain to the Baltic, from the Mediterranean to the North Sea. And for the keepers of these lights, each night was a quiet battle against the elements. In most regions, the fuel was simple: wood when it could be had, or coal hauled up narrow staircases, one bucket at a time. These fires were hungry, insatiable things. They demanded constant feeding. An armload of wood every hour, sometimes more. A keeper could never rest for long. The fire would begin to dim, to falter, and out there in the darkness, ships were depending on that light. During the day, the thick smoke rising from these beacons became a guide of its own, a dark column visible for miles, marking the headland or harbor entrance. But that same smoke was a torment. In strong winds, it would swirl and eddy, choking the flames, robbing them of oxygen, even as the wind threatened to tear them apart. Wind was the keeper's constant adversary, too strong, and it would whip the fire into a shower of dangerous sparks, scattering embers across the tower platform. Or it might rush in from the wrong angle and simply extinguish the flames entirely, as easily as you or I might blow out a candle. The keeper had to understand the wind, had to learn to shield the fire while still allowing enough airflow to keep it burning strong. Too much protection, and the fire would suffocate. Too little, and the wind would destroy it. It was a delicate balance, adjusted moment by moment throughout the long night. Eventually, many lighthouses built enclosed lantern rooms, glass chambers at the tower's summit, where the flame could burn, protected from the worst of the weather. But even these were no perfect sanctuary. Wind-driven rain would lash against the glass panes, and in winter, ice would form in thick sheets, blocking the light as effectively as any fog. So the keeper would venture out onto the narrow gallery that circled the lantern room, even in the height of a storm. The wind would tear at their clothes, rain would blind them, but they would work methodically around the gallery, clearing each pane of glass, scraping away ice with stiffened fingers, wiping away the salt spray that crusted everything within miles of the sea. Because the light had to be visible, ships were out there in that same storm, fighting for their lives. Captains were straining their eyes toward the coast, desperate for just a glimpse of the beacon that would tell them where they were, whether they were safe or sailing toward the rocks. The keeper knew this. Every keeper knew this. And so they climbed out into the storm, again and again, night after night, to clear the glass and tend the flame. It was exhausting work, dangerous work, work that left you soaked and frozen and aching. But it was necessary work, essential work, the kind of work that saved lives you would never know about, ships you would never see, sailors who would never know your name but owed you their survival. In the morning, when the storm had passed and the light could finally be extinguished, the keeper might stand at the gallery railing and look out at the calm sea. And perhaps they would wonder how many vessels had passed safely in the night, guided by the light they had fought so hard to keep burning. We will never know most of their names, these keepers, but every soul who ever made it home through a storm owes something to their vigilance. Change, when it came slowly, but it came. The open fires that had burned since ancient times gradually gave way to something more refined, more controllable. Oil lamps, simple at first, then increasingly sophisticated. Instead of feeding endless armloads of wood into hungry flames, keepers could now pour whale oil or seal oil into reservoirs, trimming wicks with careful precision. The light was steadier now, more predictable. The keeper could measure the fuel, calculate how long it would last, plan their night with a precision that had been impossible in the age of wood and coal. The flame still danced, still required tending, but it was a flame that could be mastered, understood, controlled. Then came gas. In the 19th century, some lighthouses began installing gas burners, pipes carrying coal gas or vaporized petroleum up to the lantern room, where it burned with a brilliant, unwavering intensity. Turn a valve, strike a match, and light bloomed instantly, no longer dependent on the temperament of wood or the quality of oil. And finally, in time, electricity arrived. The electric arc lamp, blazing with an intensity that would have seemed like sorcery to the ancients. Later still, the incandescent bulb, clean, reliable, requiring nothing more than a switch and a steady current. With each evolution, the light grew less vulnerable to the wind and weather that had tormented earlier keepers. An electric bulb cared nothing for rain or ice. A gas flame burned steady, regardless of the gale howling outside. The keeper's battle against the elements eased, degree by degree, innovation by innovation. But the sea never stopped testing these towers. The tallest lighthouses, those graceful spires rising hundreds of feet above the waves, would sway in the fiercest storms. You could feel it if you stood in the lantern room during a gale, a slow, almost gentle oscillation, the tower flexing like a reed in the wind. The engineers had built them to sway. A rigid structure would crack and crumble, but one that could bend, that could dance with the wind, would endure. Still, that movement meant that even the most sophisticated optical apparatus, those brilliant assemblies of glass prisms and brass gears, could be disturbed by a particularly violent gust. A lens might shift a fraction of an inch. A gear might slip. The beam sweeping across the water might stutter in its rotation, its perfect rhythm disrupted for just a moment, and the keeper would climb the stairs once more, tools in hand, to make the small adjustments needed to restore precision. Technology had transformed the lighthouse, had made the keeper's work safer and more efficient. But it had not eliminated the need for human presence, for human vigilance. The machines were remarkable, yes, but they still required someone who understood them, someone who could coax them back to life when they faltered. The light had evolved from open fire to electric brilliance, but the watcher in the dark remained, still essential, still vigilant, still there through every storm. But progress has always demanded sacrifice, and nowhere was this truer than at a treacherous reef 14 miles off the coast of Plymouth, England. The Eddystone rocks, a jagged spine of stone lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to tear the hull from any ship that strayed too close. For centuries, these rocks had claimed vessels and lives without number. Everyone knew a light was needed there, but building on Eddystone seemed impossible. The reef was submerged at high tide, battered constantly by the open Atlantic, far from any shore. In 1698, a man named Henry Winstanley accepted the challenge. He was not an engineer by training. He was an inventor, an entrepreneur, perhaps something of a dreamer. But he was determined, and so he built the first true offshore lighthouse, a wooden tower rising from the Eddystone rocks, an audacious structure that seemed to defy the sea itself. For 5 years, Winstanley's lighthouse stood. 5 years of guiding ships safely past the rocks. 5 years of proving that humanity could build even in the most hostile places. Winstanley was proud of his creation, so proud that when people questioned its strength, he declared he wished only to be inside it during the greatest storm that ever was. He got his wish. In November of 1703, the great storm descended upon Britain, a tempest so violent it would become legend. And Henry Winstanley was at his lighthouse overseeing repairs when the storm struck. When dawn broke and the winds finally calmed, the lighthouse was gone, completely gone, swept away as if it had never existed. Winstanley and everyone with him had vanished into the waves. The sea had reclaimed the rocks and taken the lives of those who dared to challenge it. But the need remained. Ships were still sinking on Eddystone. And so, in 1709, another man tried. John Rudyard was a silk merchant with no more engineering training than Winstanley, but he learned from that first failure. His tower was different, conical, lower, designed to let the waves sweep over rather than batter against it. And it worked. Rudyard's lighthouse stood for 47 years, nearly half a century of service, of lives saved, of light burning faithfully above the Eddystone rocks. Until the night the chimney caught fire. It began small, perhaps, a spark, an ember lodged in the wooden flue. But wood, once it begins to burn inside a structure, is merciless. The fire spread through the tower's interior, consuming the wooden framework, the wooden stairs, the wooden supports. The keepers tried to fight it, but there was nowhere to go, no escape from a burning tower surrounded by 14 miles of open ocean. They survived, rescued by boat in the morning. But the lighthouse was a blackened shell, destroyed from within by the very element it had housed. Wood had proven itself vulnerable not just to the sea's fury, but to fire's hunger. 2 lighthouses, 2 failures, decades of effort, and lives lost in the trying. But each failure taught a lesson. Each disaster revealed what would not work, pointing the way toward what might. The Eddystone rocks still needed their light, and there were still people willing to try. The story was not over. In 1759, a civil engineer named John Smeaton came to Eddystone. He had studied the failures of those who came before, and he understood what was needed. Not wood, vulnerable to fire and storm. Stone, granite, cut, and fitted with a precision that had never been attempted on such a structure. But this was not simply a tower of stacked stones. Smeaton pioneered something revolutionary, interlocking granite blocks, each one shaped to lock into its neighbors like pieces of a puzzle. Each stone had dovetails, curves, joints that made it impossible for one block to shift without moving all the others. The tower would not be merely built. It would be woven together, each piece inseparable from the whole. And the mortar, this was perhaps Smeaton's greatest innovation. He developed a hydraulic lime mortar, a mixture that could set under water, that actually hardened in the presence of seawater. As the stones were laid, the mortar bonded them into a single, watertight mass, turning individual blocks into one monolithic structure. Smeaton looked to nature for his design. He shaped his tower like an oak tree trunk, broad at the base, tapering as it rose, curved rather than straight. When waves struck this form, they didn't hit a flat surface that could be battered and broken. Instead, the water climbed the curve, rose up the tower's side, and dissipated, spending its fury on air rather than stone. The tower was completed in 1759, and it stood. Through winter gales and summer storms, through decades and then generations, it stood. 120 years it endured on those savage rocks, a testament to human ingenuity and the strength of properly placed stone. But if Smeaton's achievement was remarkable, what came next was almost miraculous. 12 miles off the coast of Scotland, near the entrance to the Firth of Forth, lay the Bell Rock, a reef even more treacherous than Eddystone, completely submerged at high tide, invisible and waiting to destroy any ship that came near. For centuries, it had been considered impossible to build upon. In 1807, Robert Stevenson, grandfather of the writer Robert Louis Stevenson, accepted what seemed an impossible commission. He would build a lighthouse on Bell Rock. The challenges were staggering. The reef vanished beneath the waves twice each day. Construction could only occur during brief windows of low tide, perhaps 2 hours at a time, if they were fortunate. For half of each day, the work site simply ceased to exist, swallowed by the North Sea. Stevenson's solution was ingenious. He commissioned a floating forge ship, anchored near the reef, where smiths could work throughout the tidal cycle, shaping the tools and iron fittings needed for the next low tide. When the water retreated, the workers would scramble onto the exposed rock and labor with desperate efficiency, knowing the sea would return to claim their workspace in mere hours. They cut into the living rock creating a foundation. Then, following Smeaton's example but refining it further, they laid dovetailed granite blocks, each one precisely shaped, each one locking into its neighbors with unbreakable intimacy. Stone by stone, tide by tide, the tower rose from the reef. It took 4 years. 4 years of racing against tides, of working through storms, of returning each day to continue what the sea had interrupted the day before. But in 1811, the light was finally kindled at the summit of Bell Rock Lighthouse. Both towers, Smeaton's Eddystone and Stevenson's Bell Rock, have now survived more than 200 years of storms, 2 centuries of the Atlantic's fury, and they stand unmoved. The waves that destroyed Winstanley's wooden tower crash against these stone sentinels and fall back, defeated. They are more than lighthouses. They are proof, carved in granite and bound with mortar, that human determination can create permanence even in the most impermanent places, that we can build things that endure, that protect, that stand watch over the dark water long after their builders have passed into memory. The stone triumphed, and the light, once so fragile and vulnerable, became eternal. But we should not speak of these triumphs without acknowledging the cost of their creation. The cost measured not in lives lost, though the danger was ever present, but in human endurance, in days and weeks of grinding hardship that tested every person who worked on these towers. At Eddystone, the workers often faced weeks without being able to land on the reef. The sea was too rough, the waves too violent. Smeaton's crew would remain on their supply vessel, watching the rocks, waiting for a calm enough day to resume their work. Provisions would run low. Tempers would fray. And all the while, the clock ticked, each day of delay, pushing the project further into autumn, closer to the winter storms that would make work impossible. Even Smeaton himself was not immune to the sea's power. During construction, he was swept from the rocks by a wave, dragged into the churning water. By fortune or providence, he was rescued, pulled from the ocean by his crew. But the incident served as a stark reminder. The sea was allowing them to build here. It could revoke that permission at any moment. At Bell Rock, the challenges multiplied. The foundation of the tower required cofferdams, temporary walls built around sections of the reef, then pumped dry so workers could cut and shape the living rock beneath. It was back-breaking work, made infinitely harder by the tides that repeatedly flooded the work sites. Imagine the frustration. Hours spent building a cofferdam, carefully sealing every gap, pumping out the seawater liter by liter. The workers would descend into the temporary dry space and begin their labor, cutting, measuring, preparing the foundation. And then, with the tide's return, the sea would reclaim everything. The cofferdam would flood. The workspace would vanish. Tools would be washed away. Hammers and chisels, measuring devices, irreplaceable equipment swept into the depths. Mortar, carefully mixed and ready to be applied, would be dissolved by salt water. Each tide was a reset, erasing hours of progress, demanding that the work begin again. And yet they persisted. They learned to work faster, to accomplish in 2 hours what should have taken 4. They learned to secure their tools, to protect their materials, to anticipate the sea's movements like sailors reading the weather. Stevenson understood that the tower itself would face these same forces forever. So he designed defenses. The parapet at the top of the tower, the low wall surrounding the gallery, was constructed from curved granite plates, each one shaped to deflect waves upward and away, rather than allowing them to pool or strike flat. When massive waves reached the summit, nearly 100 feet above the reef, they would hit these curved plates and shatter into spray. Their force dissipated. Inside the tower, Stevenson added a central iron staircase, independent of the outer masonry. If the stone stairs were ever damaged, cracked by frost, worn by use, even partially destroyed by some unimaginable storm, the iron core would remain, ensuring the keepers could still reach the light. It was a backup system built into the very architecture, a layer of redundancy that might never be needed, but would be there if catastrophe struck. These details, the curved plates, the iron staircase, the dovetailed stones, were not mere engineering flourishes. They were lessons learned in salt water and bruised hands, in tools lost to the tide and mortar washed away. Every feature of these towers was bought with experience, with setbacks, with the slow accumulation of knowledge about how to build something that could stand against the ocean's eternal patience. The workers who built these lighthouses may not have their names carved in stone, but their struggle, their persistence, their refusal to yield to the sea, these are embedded in every granite block, every iron rail, every curved plate that deflects the waves. They built under fire, and what they built still stands. Even stone, it turns out, is not truly eternal. Smeaton's magnificent Eddystone lighthouse, which had stood for over a century, began to show a vulnerability that no one had anticipated. Not in the tower itself. That granite structure remained as sound as the day it was completed. But beneath it, the rock upon which it stood was slowly eroding. The reef itself was being worn away by the endless assault of waves, undermining the foundation. By the late 19th century, the concern had grown serious enough that a decision was made. The tower would need to be replaced. But Smeaton's work was too beautiful, too historically significant to simply abandon. When James Douglas designed the new lighthouse in 1882, he carefully dismantled the upper courses of Smeaton's tower, those precisely cut granite blocks, and incorporated them into the new structure. The stones were numbered, catalogued, given new life in a taller, stronger tower built on a more stable section of the reef. The old base of Smeaton's lighthouse still stands today, a stump of granite rising from Eddystone rocks, a memorial to the genius who proved that stone could triumph over the sea. But even Douglas's tower would not be the end of the story. In the 1960s, yet another lighthouse rose at Eddystone, this time a concrete monolith built with modern materials and modern understanding. Yet look closely at its design, and you'll see Smeaton's influence still present 2 centuries later. The base still features interlocking elements, still uses curves to deflect wave energy rather than resist it head-on. Because Smeaton's principles were sound, the materials might evolve, wood to stone, stone to concrete, but the fundamental truths he discovered remained valid. That hydraulic lime mortar he pioneered, for instance. Engineers came to understand exactly why it worked so brilliantly. The lime actually expanded as it set underwater, forcing itself into every microscopic gap between stones, gripping them with a strength that only increased over time. What seemed like alchemy was actually chemistry, a molecular bonding that turned individual blocks into a unified whole. And those dovetail joints, they weren't just clever craftsmanship. They were a solution to a specific problem. When waves strike a vertical surface, they create enormous uplift forces, trying to pluck individual stones from their positions. But a dovetailed stone cannot be removed without moving its neighbors. And those neighbors are locked to their neighbors, and so on, throughout the structure. The wave isn't fighting a single stone. It's fighting the entire tower. The forces these towers endure would be difficult to comprehend if you haven't witnessed them. Waves at Eddystone have been measured at 90 feet high, waves as tall as a 9-story building, striking with the force of an avalanche. The entire tower disappears beneath these moving mountains of water, engulfed completely, and yet it stands. How? Mass. Sheer, incredible mass. These towers contain thousands upon thousands of tons of stone or concrete, their weight pressing down into the reef with unimaginable pressure. and their centers of gravity are kept deliberately low. The broadest, heaviest portions are at the base, creating a stability that even 90-foot waves cannot overturn. It's a kind of judo, really. The tower doesn't try to stop the wave. It lets the water climb, lets it expend its energy upward rather than breaking against resistance. And when the wave passes, the tower remains, shedding water like a surfacing whale, unmoved and unmoving. Each generation learned from the last. Each lighthouse incorporated the wisdom of its predecessors while addressing their weaknesses. Wood taught them about fire. Stone taught them about permanence. Erosion taught them about choosing foundations carefully. And the sea, the eternal teacher, kept testing them, kept showing them what worked and what didn't. The Eddystone rocks have now held 4 lighthouses across more than 3 centuries, each one better than the last, each one carrying forward the lessons of those that came before. Evolution and reinvention, not just of materials and methods, but of understanding itself. We are still learning from the sea, and the sea, patient as always, continues its instruction. While engineers were perfecting the towers themselves, another revolution was unfolding in the lantern rooms at their summits, a revolution in light itself. For all the progress in lighthouse construction, the fundamental problem remained. How do you take a single flame and make it visible for 20, 30, 40 miles across the open ocean? Mirrors helped, certainly, but they were limited, inefficient, capturing only a fraction of the light and throwing it outward. Then, in 1822, a French physicist named Augustin Jean Fresnel unveiled something extraordinary. A lens unlike any that had existed before. A device that would transform lighthouse technology as profoundly as Smeaton's stone towers had transformed lighthouse architecture. The Fresnel lens doesn't simply magnify light. It gathers it. It bends every ray, every photon emanating from the lamp at its center, and directs them all outward in a concentrated beam of almost unimaginable intensity. The lens is built from concentric rings of glass, each ring carefully shaped, each one a precisely calculated curve. As light passes through each ring, it is refracted, bent toward a common direction. The rings work in concert, like an orchestra where every instrument plays the same note, until the scattered light of a single flame becomes a beam that can pierce fear and darkness for miles beyond what should be possible. But Fresnel went further. He incorporated catadioptric prisms into his design, sections of glass that use both refraction and internal reflection to capture light that would otherwise escape upward or downward, bending it back into the horizontal beam. Every bit of light that the flame produces is caught, redirected, weaponized against the darkness. Creating these lenses demanded glass of exceptional clarity and flawlessness. The slightest impurity, the smallest bubble or distortion, would scatter the light and ruin the effect. Glassmakers had to achieve a level of perfection that had rarely been required before, crafting panels that were essentially crystalline in their purity. The largest of these lenses, the first-order Fresnel lenses, stood several meters tall, rising from floor to ceiling of the lantern room. They were constructed from hundreds of individual glass prisms, each one cut and polished by hand, then assembled into these towering crystal structures. To stand beside one was to stand beside something that seemed less like a tool and more like a sculpture, a cathedral window, a work of art that happened to serve a practical purpose. And they moved. Most Fresnel lenses were mounted on rotating mechanisms, clockwork systems driven by weights descending slowly through the center of the tower, like enormous grandfather clocks. As the lens rotated around its central lamp, it created rhythmic flash patterns. One flash every 5 seconds, 2 flashes every 10 seconds, a flash, then a longer darkness, then another flash. Each lighthouse was given its own signature, its own unique rhythm of light and dark. A sailor, seeing a flash on the horizon, could consult his chart and know exactly which lighthouse he was seeing, exactly where he was on the dark ocean, simply by counting the beats of light. During the day, when the lamp was extinguished and sunlight streamed through the lantern room windows, the Fresnel lens would come alive in a different way. The prisms would catch the daylight and shatter it into jewel-like rainbows, reds and blues and greens dancing across the walls, the floor, the ceiling. The keepers would work in this kaleidoscope of color, polishing the glass, maintaining the mechanism, surrounded by light broken into its component beauty. At night, when the lamp was lit and the lens began its slow rotation, the effect was even more magical. From outside, the entire lantern room would glow, a crystalline sculpture of light, turning steadily, casting its beam across the water. The glass seemed almost alive, breathing light, pulsing with a steady rhythm that had become the heartbeat of the coast. Many of these lenses still exist. When lighthouses were automated or decommissioned, when modern electric beacons replaced the old Fresnel systems, these magnificent artifacts were carefully removed and preserved. They stand now in museums, in lighthouse visitor centers, still catching the light, still creating their rainbows. because they are more than technology. They are the moment when engineering became art, when human ingenuity created something that was beautiful precisely because it worked so perfectly. The Fresnel lens transformed light into salvation, and in doing so, became one of the most elegant objects humanity has ever made. But let us step inside these towers. Now, let us climb the spiral stairs and enter the world of those who tended the light, the keepers, whose lives were measured not in years or months, but in the rhythm of sunset and sunrise, in the turning of the lens, in the eternal cycle of lighting and extinguishing, cleaning and polishing, watching and waiting. A lighthouse keeper's life was built on routine, not the numbing routine of meaningless repetition, but the sacred routine of essential ritual, tasks that mattered, that could not be neglected, that meant the difference between life and death for people you would never meet. The primary duty, the one that superseded all others, was simple: keep the light burning through the night, every night, without fail. As dusk approached, the keeper would climb to the lantern room and prepare the lamp. If it was an oil lamp, the wicks needed trimming, cut precisely to ensure an even, steady flame. The oil reservoir needed checking, refilling if necessary. Everything had to be perfect before the sun touched the horizon, because once darkness fell, ships would be depending on that light. And then, with the lamp lit and the lens beginning its slow rotation, the keeper would begin the night watch. Most nights, this meant periodic checks, climbing the stairs every few hours to ensure the flame burned steadily, the mechanism turned smoothly. Nothing had gone wrong. But in fog, or during storms, the watch became vigorous and constant. Fog could last for days, and as long as it persisted, the light had to burn, even through daylight hours when it would normally be extinguished. Storms brought their own demands, checking that wind hadn't disturbed the flame, that rain wasn't leaking in, that everything mechanical continued functioning despite the tower's slow swaying. Sleep, during these times, became something stolen in brief intervals, always with one ear listening for the sound that meant something had gone wrong. When morning came, or when the fog finally lifted, there was no rest. The lamp would be extinguished, but the real work was just beginning. The Fresnel lens, that magnificent sculpture of glass and light, required cleaning every single day. Salt spray from the ocean would leave a haze on the prisms. Soot from the lamp would settle on the glass. Condensation from temperature changes would cloud the surfaces. Each of these would diminish the light's power, and so each had to be meticulously removed. The keeper would move slowly around the lens, cloth in hand, polishing each prism, each panel, until the glass was so clear it seemed to disappear. This could take hours. There could be hundreds of individual glass surfaces to clean, and each one had to be perfect. The lantern room windows received the same treatment, cleaned, polished, made invisible. The brass and metalwork were polished daily until they gleamed. This wasn't vanity. It was professionalism. It was pride. It was the knowledge that your work would save lives, but only if it was done right. And then there was the clockwork mechanism that rotated the lens. These were marvels of engineering, systems of gears and wheels driven by slowly descending weights, similar to the mechanisms in tower clocks. The weights, often weighing hundreds of pounds, would be suspended from cables running down through the center of the lighthouse, sometimes descending all the way to the base of the tower. Gravity would pull these weights downward, and as they descended, they would turn gears that rotated the lens at a precise, steady speed. But gravity is relentless. The weights needed to be wound back up, cranked by hand using a windlass, multiple times each night. This was hard physical labor, made harder by exhaustion, by the late hour, by the constant awareness that if you didn't wind the weights, if you let them run all the way down, the lens would stop rotating. The flash pattern would fail. And out there in the darkness, a captain might be counting those flashes, using them to navigate, trusting that the rhythm he knew would be there. It was responsibility without reprieve. It was commitment that couldn't falter. It was the knowledge that your routine, however tedious it might become, was the only thing standing between ships and disaster. And so the keepers maintained their rituals. Day after day, night after night, through fair weather and foul, through isolation and loneliness, and the particular kind of weariness that comes from work that never truly ends. They kept the light burning. It was what they did. It was who they were. But the work was only part of the burden. Perhaps not even the heaviest part. A lighthouse keeper was also a meteorologist, a chronicler of the sea's moods. Weather and visibility had to be recorded meticulously. Temperature, wind direction, and speed. The state of the sea. The density of fog. Multiple times each day, these observations went into the logbook, creating a detailed record that might one day help understand the patterns of this particular stretch of coast. The keeper maintained generators when lighthouses gained electricity, maintained fog signals, great horns and bells that sounded during thick weather, their mournful calls adding another layer to the keeper's duties. maintained the landings where supply boats would arrive, ensuring the ramps and moorings stayed functional despite the sea's constant assault. These were the tasks you could measure, could check off, could complete. But there were other challenges that couldn't be solved through diligence or discipline. At remote stations, particularly the offshore towers like Bell Rock or the American Lights perched on wave-swept rocks, keepers could be stranded for weeks at a time. When storms made the sea too violent for supply boats to approach, you simply waited. When fog descended and lasted for days, you remained at your post. There was no stepping outside for a walk, no neighbors to visit, no change of scenery. Just the tower, just the sea, just the endless rotation of the lens and the sound of waves against stone. Loneliness could become crushing. Monotony could bore into your mind like a slow drill. Depression was common among keepers, though rarely discussed. The isolation, the sameness of each day, the weight of responsibility without relief, these could break even strong people. The strict routines that governed lighthouse life weren't just about maintaining the light. They were about maintaining the keeper. Structure was a lifeline. The regular tasks, the predictable schedule, the logbook entries, made multiple times daily. These created a framework that could hold you together when everything else felt like it was dissolving into fog and loneliness. The logbook became almost sacred. Every detail recorded, every task noted, every observation documented. Weather at dawn, lamp lit at dusk, lens cleaned, weights wound, fog signal started, fog signal stopped, ship sighted, supply boat arrived. The entries became a kind of conversation with yourself, proof that time was passing, that you were still here, still functional, still doing your duty. And someone was watching. Quarterly inspections meant a lighthouse official would arrive without warning, examining everything with an almost military precision. The glass had to be spotless. The brass had to gleam. The logbook had to be complete and accurate. Even minor lapses could result in reprimands, fines, or dismissal. It was harsh, perhaps, but lives depended on these standards. At larger, shore-based stations, families sometimes lived together in the keeper's quarters. This helped. Wives and children sharing the duties, providing companionship, making the lighthouse feel less like a prison and more like a home. Children grew up learning to polish brass and trim wicks, understanding from an early age that their family's work was important, that it mattered. But even at these stations, isolation could be profound. Lighthouse families lived apart from towns, from neighbors, from the normal rhythms of community life. Supplies arrived quarterly by boat. Crates of flour and tinned goods, coal or oil for the lamp, replacement parts for the machinery, letters from the mainland. These visits were events, breaks in the routine, connections to the wider world, until storms delayed them. When the supply boat couldn't make its scheduled run, and it often couldn't, particularly in winter, the keepers would begin rationing what remained. Meals became smaller. Luxuries like coffee or sugar would be conserved, stretched, made to last until the weather cleared and the boat could finally reach them. And through it all, the night watches continued. Every few hours, the keeper would climb the spiral stairs, dozens, sometimes hundreds of steps, to check the light. In your first weeks at a lighthouse, your legs would burn from these repeated climbs. Eventually, your body would adapt, and you could make the ascent in darkness, your feet knowing each worn step without conscious thought. Relief crews rotated every one to 3 months at the most remote stations. When your relief finally arrived, when you could step into the boat and leave the rock behind, the mainland seemed almost surreal. Too loud, too crowded, overwhelming after weeks or months of near total silence and solitude. And yet, keepers would return, tour after tour, year after year, because the work mattered, because someone had to do it, because out there in the darkness, ships were depending on the light you kept burning. It was hard work, lonely work, work that demanded more than most people could give. But it was also work that meant something, work that saved lives, work that mattered in the most fundamental way. The keepers endured, and the light never failed. The danger didn't end with keeping the light burning. In many ways, that was just the beginning. Medical care at remote lighthouses was primitive at best, non-existent at worst. When a keeper injured themselves, a slip on wet stairs, a burn from the lamp, a gash from broken glass, there was no doctor to call. No ambulance would arrive. The keeper, or their fellow keepers, would have to treat the injury themselves with whatever supplies were on hand. A medical chest with bandages, antiseptics, perhaps laudanum for pain. A manual describing basic treatments written for people with no medical training. And your own steady hands trying to suture a wound or set a broken bone, hoping you were doing it right, knowing that infection or complications could turn serious because help was days or weeks away. But physical injury was only one kind of danger, because lighthouse keepers didn't just tend the light. When ships wrecked on the rocks, they were supposed to warn away from, and ships did wreck, despite the light, despite everything. The keepers became rescuers. They would launch lifeboats into seas that had just destroyed a larger vessel. They would row out into darkness and storm toward the cries of drowning sailors. They would pull survivors from the water, sometimes successfully, sometimes arriving too late, sometimes dying in the attempt. Many keepers lost their lives this way, not from the monotony or the isolation, but from the final extension of their duty. The light was meant to prevent disaster, but when prevention failed, the keeper went to meet the disaster directly, to save what could be saved. Their names are recorded, when they're recorded at all, in the margins of maritime history. A brief notation. Keeper lost attempting rescue. A line in a logbook. A grave marker near a lighthouse if their body was recovered. They were not required to launch those boats. It was not in their job description to risk their lives beyond keeping the light. But they did it anyway, because when you spend your life trying to save people that you'll never meet, it becomes impossible to stand by and watch them die when you might be able to help. And then there was the other danger, the one that was harder to define, harder to combat. Lighthouse insanity, some called it, though that term is too harsh, too clinical for what was really a slow erosion of my mental health under conditions that few people could endure indefinitely. The isolation could do strange things to a mind. The monotony could create obsessions, fixations, paranoia. Keepers would sometimes report hearing voices in the wind, seeing figures in the fog. The boundary between imagination and reality could blur when you spent months with only your own thoughts for company. Some keepers broke. They had to be relieved, taken back to the mainland, replaced by someone who hadn't yet been worn down by the solitude. It wasn't weakness. It was simply the human mind reaching its limit. But most keepers found ways to cope, ways to stay grounded, to remain themselves despite everything working against them. Reading became a lifeline. Lighthouses maintained small libraries. Books passed between stations, read and reread until the pages were soft as cloth. Adventure novels, technical manuals, poetry, anything that could transport your mind away from the tower for a few hours. Games helped. Chess problems worked out over days. Solitaire played with worn cards. Puzzles assembled and disassembled, assembled again. Many keepers took up carving. Scrimshaw, if they could get ivory or bone. Wood carving with driftwood collected from the rocks. Creating something beautiful from simple materials. Something you could hold in your hands and see your progress. Feel your skill improving. It was a way to prove to yourself that time was passing productively, that you were more than just a mechanism for tending the light. And pets, dogs, cats, even birds, any living creature that could provide companionship, that could remind you what it meant to care for something beyond duty. A dog that would greet you when you descended from the night watch. A cat that would curl up beside you as you filled out the logbook. These small comforts mattered more than anyone who hasn't experienced that isolation could understand. The keepers adapted. They endured. They found ways to remain human in circumstances that seemed designed to strip humanity away. And when they couldn't endure any longer, when the weight became too much, there was no shame in that either. They had done their duty. They had kept the light burning for as long as they could. And someone else would take their place, would climb those stairs, would tend that flame, would continue the watch. The light never failed, but it was kept by people who could, and sometimes did. And there is no dishonor in reaching your limit. We should speak now of something rarely mentioned in the grand narratives of lighthouse history: the smell. Because these towers were not pristine temples of light, they were working structures, and the work was often dirty, often pungent, often an assault on the senses that would stay with you long after you left the lantern room. In the early days, whale oil was the fuel of choice. It burned bright and steady, which was all that mattered when lives were at stake. But it reeked. A thick, fishy odor of decay that permeated everything. Your clothes would absorb it. Your skin would carry it. Even your food would taste faintly of whale oil after months in a lighthouse, the smell having seeped into every corner of the tower. And the soot. Every morning when you climbed to the lantern room to extinguish the lamp and begin your cleaning, you would find the Fresnel lens coated in thick, oily soot. Black residue on those perfect prisms, on the brass fittings, on the windows. The cleaning was never finished. Not really. You could polish until your arms ached, until the glass gleamed. And the next morning, the soot would be there again, waiting. For a time, lard oil replaced whale oil. It was cheaper, more readily available, but it smelled of rendered meat, a greasy, animal odor that was somehow worse than the whale oil's decay. And in cold weather, lard oil would congeal, thickening in the reservoir until the lamp guttered and threatened to go out. Keepers would have to warm it, coax it back to liquid, all while the clock ticked toward sunset, and ships were depending on that light. By the late 1870s, kerosene became the standard. It burned brighter than anything that had come before, and it was more reliable than the animal oils. but it smelled volatile, chemical, a sharp odor that could make your eyes water and your head ache during long night watches in the enclosed lantern room. Cleaning became a chemistry lesson. Vinegar-soaked rags to cut through the chemical residue that kerosene left behind. The acetic acid would dissolve the films and deposits, but it added its own sharp tang to the lighthouse's bouquet of scents. The lantern room became a place of layered odors: kerosene, vinegar, metal polish, the salt spray that came in whenever you opened a ventilation panel. Some lighthouses experimented with colza oil, pressed from rapeseed. It had a vegetal smell, almost pleasant at first, but colza oil turned rancid with alarming speed, especially in the summer heat. The smell of spoiled vegetable oil is distinctive and deeply unpleasant. And once a barrel had turned, there was nothing to do but endure it until the quarterly supply boat arrived with fresh fuel. The fuel barrels themselves were a constant source of trouble. They leaked. They always leaked. Pungent residue would seep out, pooling in the storage rooms, soaking into the wooden floors and stone walls. The bottom levels of many lighthouses carried a permanent odor of whatever fuel they burned, a smell that would hit you like a wall when you entered from the fresh sea air outside. And the work of maintaining these lamps was precise and dangerous. Wick trimming had to be exact. Too short, and the flame would be weak. Too long, and it would smoke excessively, wasting fuel and creating even more soot. The keeper would use small scissors, trimming the charred portion of the wick while the lamp burned, leaning close to the flame in the enclosed space, breathing fumes, fingers blackening with carbon. A moment's inattention could mean a burn, or worse. Spilled kerosene could ignite. Fumes could overcome you. The lamp was a small, controlled fire, but fire nonetheless, and it demanded respect every moment it burned. Then came electricity, and everything changed. No more soot coating the lenses each morning. No more pungent oils and their endless odors. No more wick trimming or fuel measuring or the constant fear of fire. An electric bulb burned clean, turning on with the flip of a switch, shining with steady intensity that required only that the current remain flowing. The lantern rooms became almost sterile by comparison. The smell of metal and glass and ozone, but none of the organic reek of burning oils. Keepers could breathe easily in the lantern room for the first time in centuries. But electricity brought its own challenges. The early bulbs were fragile, susceptible to the vibrations that storms created in the swaying towers. a bulb might flicker during a gale or fail entirely, and suddenly the keeper would need to switch to the backup lamp, often still an oil or kerosene system, kept ready for emergencies. Progress never eliminated the need for vigilance. It only changed what you had to be vigilant about. Still, for keepers who had spent years breathing whale oil fumes and scrubbing soot, the arrival of electric light must have seemed miraculous. The work was still demanding, still isolating, still dangerous. But at least now, when you descended from the lantern room after a night's watch, you didn't carry the smell of burnt oil in your clothes and hair. Small mercies, perhaps, but in a life measured in small moments, repeated endlessly, even small mercies mattered. Change had been coming for centuries, from fire to oil to electricity. Each innovation making the keeper's work a little easier, a little safer. But the change that came in the mid-20th century was different. This change would eliminate the keeper entirely. Automation. The technology had been developing for decades. Electric motors that could rotate lenses without human winding. Light sensors that could detect sunset and switch the lamp on automatically. Backup systems that could engage if the primary bulb failed. Gradually, the lighthouse was becoming a machine that could tend itself. The transition happened slowly, lighthouse by lighthouse, coast by coast. Each nation had its own timeline, its own reasons for delay or acceleration. But the direction was inevitable. Boston Light, the oldest lighthouse station in the United States, held out until 1989. It was one of the last American lighthouses to be automated, kept staffed more for tradition than necessity. When the Coast Guard finally removed the last keeper, it marked the end of something that had existed since colonial times, a human presence watching over Boston Harbor night after night, generation after generation. That same year, across the Atlantic, Fastnet Rock was automated. The Teardrop of Ireland, that lonely sentinel off the southwestern coast, had been one of the most challenging assignments in lighthouse keeping. Remote, battered by Atlantic storms, it had demanded everything from those who served there. And now, suddenly, it required no one. The clockwork mechanisms that had needed constant winding were replaced by electric motors that ran until the power failed. And then backup generators would engage. The systems could monitor themselves, report problems via radio, continue functioning without human intervention for weeks or months at a time. It was efficient. It was reliable. It was, in every practical sense, an improvement. But something was lost. The technology continued evolving even after the keepers departed. Radar beacons, Raycon systems, were added to many lighthouses, transmitting coded radar signals that would appear on ships' radar screens, identifying the lighthouse even in zero visibility. Now, a lighthouse could be seen by machines even when fog made it invisible to human eyes. Then, in 1993, GPS became available to civilians. The Global Positioning System, originally developed for military use, was opened to the world. Suddenly, any vessel with a GPS receiver could know its exact position to within meters, anywhere on Earth, regardless of weather or visibility. The lighthouse beam, which had guided mariners for thousands of years, was becoming redundant. Ships no longer needed to count the flashes from a distant light to know where they were. They could simply look at their GPS display and see their position marked on an electronic chart. Reliance on lighthouse beams declined sharply. Some lights were extinguished entirely, deemed unnecessary in the age of satellite navigation. Others were maintained more for historical value than navigational necessity. Monuments to an earlier age kept lit as much for tradition as for any practical purpose. But then, something interesting happened. Maritime authorities began to recognize a vulnerability in GPS. The system was powerful, yes, but it was also fragile. GPS signals could be jammed, spoofed, disrupted. Solar storms could interfere with satellite communications. And if GPS failed, whether through technical malfunction, deliberate interference, or some unforeseen catastrophe, what would ships use to navigate? Physical backups suddenly mattered again. Lighthouses, those ancient technologies, represented a navigation system that couldn't be jammed from thousands of miles away, couldn't be hacked, couldn't fail because of a problem in orbit. They were there, solid and real, light shining across the water, regardless of what satellites or computers were doing. Interest in maintaining lighthouse infrastructure was revived, not as primary navigation aids, but as resilient backups for an increasingly digital maritime world. Many lights now carry AIS transponders, automatic identification system devices that broadcast the lighthouse's position and identity to any vessel with AIS receivers. The lighthouse has become part of the digital network, its ancient purpose translated into electronic signals that modern ships can read and understand. The towers still stand. The lights still sweep across the water each night. But they do it alone now, without the keepers who once made them their world. The stairs still spiral upward, but no one climbs them to wind the weights or polish the glass. The lantern rooms still hold their Fresnel lenses, but those magnificent crystal structures now rotate without human hands to maintain them. Automation brought efficiency and safety. It freed people from isolation and hardship, from the grinding routine and psychological strain of lighthouse life. But it also ended something that had been continuous since ancient times: the presence of a watcher in the dark, a human being whose purpose was to keep the light burning, to stand vigil through the night, to be there when the sea demanded sacrifice. The lights still shine, but the watchers are gone. But the story does not end with absence. The watchers may be gone, but the watch continues. Maritime authorities around the world have made a deliberate choice to keep lighthouse systems active and maintained. These are no longer the primary means of navigation. That role has been claimed by satellites and electronics. But they remain as fail-safes, as backups for the day when the digital systems might fail. GPS is extraordinary, but it is not infallible. And so the lights continue to burn, insurance against the unthinkable, guardians held in reserve. The magnificent Fresnel lenses, those crystal towers that once rotated in every major lighthouse, have largely been retired from active service. But they have not been discarded. Museums across the world have welcomed them, displaying these artifacts with the reverence they deserve. Visitors can stand beside them now, can see the rainbows dance through their prisms when sunlight strikes at the right angle, can appreciate the artistry and engineering that made them possible. These lenses are no longer tools. They have become art, history made visible, evidence of what human ingenuity could achieve when lives depended on light. The lighthouses themselves have been transformed by modern technology. LEDs have replaced the old bulbs, the oil lamps, the whale oil flames of centuries past. These solid-state lights consume a fraction of the power, produce exponentially more light, and can last for over 100,000 hours of continuous operation, more than 11 years without replacement. Solar panels now crown many lighthouse towers, particularly those in remote locations where running power lines would be impractical. The sun that rises each morning charges batteries that power the light through the night. It is an elegant solution, self-sustaining, requiring minimal maintenance. The fuel risks that once haunted keepers, fire, explosion, asphyxiation, have been eliminated entirely. Advanced monitoring systems watch over these lights now. Sensors detect if a bulb fails, if power drops, if any component shows signs of malfunction. This information is transmitted via radio or cellular networks to monitoring stations where technicians can track the health of dozens or hundreds of lights simultaneously. If something goes wrong, they know immediately. Response teams can be dispatched before a single night passes without light. Redundancy has been built into every system. If the primary LED array fails, a backup engages automatically. If shore power fails, battery banks take over. If batteries deplete, backup generators start. The modern lighthouse has layers of protection against failure, ensuring near-perfect uptime year after year. These are not the temperamental flames that keepers once battled to keep alive through storms. These are robust, reliable systems that function with a consistency that would have seemed miraculous to Henry Winstanley or Robert Stevenson. And yet, the purpose remains unchanged. Light in the darkness, a fixed point in the uncertainty of the sea, a promise kept night after night that the dangerous places are marked, that safe passage is possible, that someone, something, is watching. The technology has evolved beyond recognition. Fire has given way to solid-state electronics. Human keepers have given way to automated systems and remote monitoring. But the fundamental mission endures, unbroken across millennia. From the first beacon, fires on ancient hills, to the LED arrays powered by sunlight, the lighthouse has always been humanity's answer to the darkness and danger of the sea. It is one of our oldest technologies, and in some form, it remains necessary even now, even in an age of satellites and computers. Because the sea has not changed. It is still vast, still powerful, still capable of destroying the unwary. And as long as ships sail upon it, as long as people venture into that ancient danger, there will be value in a light that shines from the shore, simple, reliable, visible proof that land is near, that safety is possible, that the way home is marked. The watchers in the dark may be gone, but the light they tended, the mission they served, continues without them. The towers still stand. The beams still sweep across the water. And somewhere out there, in the darkness, ships still find their way home by that light. The legacy lives. The watch goes on. And the light, always eternally, keeps burning. Automation ended the age of keepers. That era, which stretched back through centuries to the first fires on ancient hills, has passed into history. The last keepers have descended those spiral stairs for the final time, leaving the towers to their solitude and their machines. But the lighthouses themselves endure. They have become something more than navigational aids now. They are symbolic guardians, standing watch over coasts they have protected for generations. Their silhouettes against the sky mark the boundary between land and sea, between safety and danger, between the known world and the vast unknown. And mariners still look for them, even with GPS displays showing their exact position, even with radar and electronic charts and all the digital certainty that modern navigation provides. Sailors still find themselves searching the horizon for that familiar flash, counting the rhythm, confirming what the instruments tell them by what their eyes can see. There is comfort in that light, a reassurance that goes deeper than logic or technology. It is the same comfort that sailors felt 1,000 years ago, seeing a beacon fire burning on a distant hill. The knowledge that someone, something, is marking the dangerous places, keeping watch through the darkness. Stone and glass and light. These simple elements, combined with human ingenuity and determination, continue their ancient work, warning the sea, guiding the lost, marking the way home. The towers stand, patient and eternal, as they have always stood. The lights sweep across the water, as they have for centuries. And somewhere in the darkness, a ship finds its bearing by that flash, that pulse of light cutting through fog and night. The watchers may be gone, but the watch continues. The light endures.